By looking at the dominant design, we can get an idea of buying behavior in terms of where people are vis-a-vis the dominant design. If a new technology is introduced and it's not clear what dominant design it relates to and what's going on with it, people are still trying to figure out the features and functionalities. What does that mean? That means it's hard to use. It's not necessarily refined yet. You don't know what you have. So it's really the geeks, the techno-weenies who are playing with it. It's like the days of the early personal computer. The first personal computers came about because somebody at Intel invented a chip that you could program. And then all these engineers said, well, that's kind of cool. I can build my own machine that will allow me to run calculations at home rather than having to wait for time on the mainframe. I was writing my dissertation back then. I remember some of my friends in engineering beginning to build their own computers. I was in philosophy and was not in the least bit interested in building a computer. I was sitting there on my typewriter that typed German letters because I was writing a dissertation that dealt with the history of Marxism, and I was writing about Hegel and Marx and all these guys and the post-Marxist, neo-Marxist people. So be that as it may, anyways, the point is the early adopters, my buddies who were engineers, who were the geeks, they were playing with these things because they could figure out how to play with them and program them. That was stuff I didn't understand. After a while, however, though, some people started to make the computers, guys like, there were companies like K-Pro and Osborne. What you discovered was the early computers that my friends who were engineers were making sort of looked like rack mounts. It's like you pulled it out of the rack, an oscilloscope. It had a little screen, it had a CPU in there, some memory in there, and it had to store stuff, and they had an input device, which in this case was a keyboard, rather than a bunch of cards like we used to punch cards and then take them down to the computer center and they'd run them on the big mainframes. Anyways, they had a small keyboard that they could type with based upon the same kind of keyboard you type the punch card, only this time it went directly into the machine rather than having to punch a card and take the card to the machine. So they take these out, they drop them down into little metal cases. All of a sudden you got a little luggable kind of computer that's a personal computer that basically looks like something you pulled out of a rack mount, and it's modeled on the dominant design of a rack mount piece of instrumentation. Not surprising, that's what engineers played with. Anyway, some other guys look at this, and after a while they say, hey, we can build these, and they started to build them, K-Pro, Osborne, and that. Companies, and then you start to hit takeoff because that made it possible for people like me to think, hey, I want to buy one of those and I don't have to worry about programming it. Equally important, by this time VisiCalc had come out, and there was also initial word processing software. I'm trying to remember what it was. It might have been WordStar. Anyway, so you didn't have to program everything. You could use the functionality, and then you could build upon that functionality. Now we're hitting takeoff. We're starting to accelerate up. If say 3 to 4% were the techno-weenies, the early adopters, graduate students like myself, others, were maybe another 15%. Notice that it's enough to get momentum going, word of mouth going. People start saying, hey, that's cool, look at what that guy's doing. Those people that they're going, hey, that's cool, are called the people who are cool, are the opinion leaders. It's starting to show up in the trade press. People are writing about it, the editors, the people who write the columns, so on and so forth. That's how you find out about it. Word of mouth is stimulating. You get a different group of people buying with different criteria for buying. After a while, everybody's rushing into the marketplace. IBM, Apple, all these new options are out there, but they're all based around the same primary design. And then you end up in this situation where you start to hit shakeout. And at that point, what happens is the rate of growth is starting to sort of slow down, and that means all the early adopters have rushed into the marketplace, and now we're into an area where maybe 34% of the buyers are coming in, and those are called the early majority. We get another 34 that are the late majority that come in, and after that the rest of them are called laggards. And that's sort of that bell curve design. The problem is the bell curve exists across all technologies for all times, where the research was done by Everett Rogers and others. So you really can't assume that this Gaussian distribution is going to exist for your technology. You have to really sort of focus on the specifics of what's going on and try and understand that in terms of the dynamics for your particular technology. When we come back, we're going to talk about buying behavior in these different customer segments, these different buyer segments as they come in over time. So I'll see you in a few seconds. Well, it's not too hard to guess what the innovators are going to buy on the basis of. They're going to buy on the basis of performance. After all, that's why they're there. They're saying, hey, this is kind of cool. I want to play for it. I want to play with it. I want something that's going to do some really cool things for me. So they're looking for a specific kind of performance that they can play around with. Typically, you get these kind of innovation communities developing at these early stages of introduction of a technology, particularly where there's no strong dominant design to sort of define the features and functionalities, and really what you're trying to do is to figure out what should be the features and functionalities. If you think about that, what's going on now is people are trying to figure out what's happening. I will give you the classic example of this, literally a classic example. Think about writing. There was a time when there was no writing. Then later on there is writing. If you remember your Plato, the major figure in the Platonic dialogues is a guy named Socrates. The difference between Socrates and Plato is Socrates is illiterate. He doesn't write. Plato does. The early dialogues are very much like reading Homer. They're, I believe the appropriate term is mnemonic devices. They help you remember the story. So they're basically writing down the story as it would be spoken. And thus the story has a certain rhythm and a certain presentation. By the late dialogues of Plato, it's very different. The story is no longer just an aid to memory, to repeating so that you can repeat it to other people as an oral tradition. The story is now meant to be read. It's very complicated. It has subplots, all sorts of things are twisted around. You're trying to understand specific words and how specific words relate to other words. This whole 9 yards that go into what they call a Straussian interpretation of Plato. But what's happened is you've gone across a Rubicon between no writing and writing. And what is Socrates arguing about? He's fighting with the poets. Why does he fight with the poets? Because the poets represent another end user group or another group of people who are trying to figure out what writing is. And Socrates and the poets are fighting about what's the appropriate character for writing, what should be the dominant design for writing. So when we have those kinds of situations, that's where we have performance-based buying, and it happens, as I said, very early on in a technology or where there's a really clear, overwhelming, powerful need, which is the exception, that is military situations, health, health, safety, those kind of things sometimes will drive rigorous performance-based buying. When we come back, we'll talk about the next type of buying. Well, if techno-weenies and geeks tend to buy on the basis of performance, the next group, the early adopters, tend to buy on the basis of best value. What they're looking for is a combination. We now know what bundles of features and functionality make up the technology. We have a dominant design that exists either for this technology or we're developing it vis-a-vis some other technology, so we know what we're building and what it should do. And because of that, it makes sense to talk about best value, because why pay more if you can get the same thing for cheaper? So you want to look at, you have a threshold. You need a certain amount of value. You need a certain amount of utility, a certain amount of performance to do what you need. But once you get that, then you're price shopping. It's like buying a hybrid car. Do you really care if it's 51 or 50 miles? Probably not. If you have two options that you like the styling the same, the looks, the whole 9 yards, and one gives you 50 miles and the other gives you 51 miles to the gallon, you're probably going to go between the two for the one that's cheapest, whether it's the 51 or the 50. That's best value pricing. You tend to get that among early adopters. Why? Because they want the performance, they need that performance, but they don't want it at any price. It has to make sense. It has to be cost efficient for them to bear the cost of trading over from what they're doing to something new.